All right, hello 12s, Mr. K here, not in the bunker. So continuing on. We had a long video. We talked about the basics, the review of chemistry, basically. So we talked about bonds. So the important bonds to remember were covalent bonds, polar covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds. We talked about acids, bases, the differences between those, the pH scale, and buffers. That's essentially what we talked about. So now we talked about chemistry, so the atoms, the way the atoms interact. Obviously, we're made out of atoms. Organisms are made out of atoms. So those atoms are interacting, and those atoms interact together to form molecules. They'll use those bonds to form molecules, which is our have multiple atoms. So there is something that is classified as organic molecules, organic compounds. You may have heard when a spacecraft travels to a moon of Jupiter, or it scans and it's looking for organic molecules, or a comet will be always full of organic molecules, and the newspapers get really excited. Organic molecules, is there life on these comets? Well, the term organic molecules, it's just something we have classified as humans, a group of molecules as organic molecules, mainly because they occur a lot in living systems. But it doesn't mean that they're part of a living system. Basically, an organic molecule is just a molecule that contains carbon. So any molecule that contains carbon and hydrogen. So carbon and hydrogen. If you have those two things, you get classified as an organic molecule. So if you went camping and you used a propane stove, well, that propane is an organic molecule. That's what you were burning. And then interestingly enough, carbon dioxide, which is something that we breathe out, for example, does have carbon, but it doesn't have hydrogen. Therefore, carbon dioxide, which is part of our metabolism, it's the waste of our metabolism, is not an organic molecule, is not classified as an organic molecule. The same for water. Water has hydrogen and oxygen, but it's not an organic molecule. You need carbon and hydrogen to be an organic molecule. So we're going to be talking about organic molecules. And these organic molecules, then there's certain ones that are then biological molecules. And so the organic molecules are then classified, subclassified into these biological molecules, and they will all have carbon and hydrogen. So carbohydrates, sugars, lipids, which are fats, nucleic acids, so DNA, RNA, and proteins. Those are biological molecules. And proteins come in amino acids. There are also other atoms that are present in biological molecules and in organic systems that you will see fairly often. The two that come right after carbon and hydrogen, so all the organic molecules in our body, the majority of our body is made up of carbon and hydrogen. Then you've got oxygen right after, and nitrogen. You'll also find a lot of nitrogen. Oxygen and nitrogen, they're amine groups as part of nitrogen. And so like you'll find nitrogen in amino acids. When we metabolize these amino acids, actually the nitrogen forms ammonia, nitrogen and hydrogen, which is toxic to us. Nitrogen becomes a problem. Nitrogen is a problem in general in systems. You need bacteria to fix nitrogen, all kinds of stuff. But it is necessary for us to have nitrogen in order for us to survive. So organic compounds, carbon, hydrogen, biological molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Atoms that you will find in biological systems are obviously carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. You also find sodium, Na, sodium, so in salts. You'll find calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. Those are basically the atoms that we're going to be encountering as we learn about all the systems and things happen. Now, the other thing we need to talk about. So we talked about chemistry. We talked about those bonds. We need to talk about two processes that are the inverse of each other and are done constantly by biological systems, and that is dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. And so when I talk about carbohydrates, carbohydrates can be lots of things. One glucose molecule, a 6-carbon sugar, 1,6-carbon sugar, which is sort of the basic, it's sort of like the currency of energy, right? We want to break sugars down into a single glucose so that then we can metabolize that glucose, basically oxidize that glucose and produce energy. That way we produce energy from glucose. But glucose doesn't, usually we have to break things down in order to get that glucose. And those glucose, so those 6-carbon glucose molecules are what's called a monomer, and they are the basic building block of carbohydrates. And you can make them into various big long chains. You can combine them together. And what you combine them with is covalent bonds. Those covalent bonds that we learned about last time, those strong covalent bonds. And in order to make those covalent bonds in organic systems, you need enzymes that do that. So we have enzymes that make those covalent bonds, that can make chains of glucose molecules. For example, if we want to store glucose, humans store glucose as glycogen, and we make these big branching chains of glucose molecules. And so we have to fuse 2 glucose molecules together with a covalent bond, and that process is called dehydration synthesis. And you will see dehydration synthesis throughout everything that we do. So when we're making DNA, we're taking individual nucleic acids, fusing them together through dehydration synthesis. When we're making proteins, when we do the unit on proteins, so we're taking individual amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and using dehydration synthesis to put those amino acids together into a chain that form a protein or an enzyme. So let's just look for a second at what dehydration synthesis looks like. Why is it called dehydration synthesis? That does sound kind of, there is something in there. Dehydration, isn't that what happens when you go jogging too much? Yes, it is. So dehydration means taking away water, and synthesis is putting things together, synthesizing. So dehydration synthesis is the taking away of water. So if we have these building blocks, so here we have, I think you guys can see, we have these 2 building blocks here. This looks like a 6-carbon sugar and another 6-carbon sugar, but these could be amino acids, these could be nucleic acids, these could be the building blocks of lipids. And all of these, so these points here would be carbons, and as I told you, we got hydrogen, obviously, because they're organic molecules, and then oxygen, which is really popular. In order to fuse these together, to bridge them with a covalent bond, what we have to do in dehydration synthesis is remove a water. Basically a hydrogen from one monomer and a hydroxide group from the other monomer get pinched off, which produces H2O, water. And when that happens, the dangling end here and the dangling end to this oxygen gets stitched together, and you have joined the 2 with a strong covalent bond. That's what happens in dehydration synthesis. And notice it produces water. So when we're building chains of DNA, we're actually producing water. Water is getting produced there. This process is endothermic, it takes up energy, it uses up energy. And we will see it everywhere. We will see it when we talk about protein synthesis, anywhere you're creating something, the body is building something, it is doing protein synthesis. It is producing actually water to do that and absorbing energy to do that. Okay? Now, we also obviously need to break these bonds as well. And remember, the covalent bonds are strong. These covalent bonds are strong. So that is a process called hydrolysis. It's done by enzymes. Sometimes the same enzyme can actually reverse the fusing together to the breaking up together. So hydrolysis. Hydro means water. Lysis means breaking. So basically breaking with water is what hydrolysis means. And water is involved here again, except this time the reverse. Dehydration synthesis produced water. Hydrolysis uses water up. So we're going to be seeing this a lot in the digestion section, right? You eat proteins. You eat huge chunks of meat, let's say, plant. It doesn't have to be meat. You can also get protein from plant. And those proteins have to be broken. They have to be broken. Those enzymes, those bonds, those covalent bonds have to be broken, so you can then take the individual amino acids and use those amino acids to make your own proteins or to metabolize them for energy. So for that you do hydrolysis. So here is an example of hydrolysis right under dehydration synthesis, and what you see is you need water to do that. You break this bond here. And then you could break this, an enzyme could just come along and chop that bond. This bond is just electrons being traded. So it could do something to disrupt those electrons being traded. But the problem is then you'd have these dangling bonds. This carbon here would basically have those electrons unfulfilled, and it would react with something that you wouldn't want. Same thing here, this oxygen would have a dangling, basically oxygen is going to want to accept electrons. It's going to cause problems. So what has to happen is water comes along. The water is split into hydrogen and hydroxide, and that hydrogen and the hydroxide are used to sew up those bonds that are unfulfilled. Electrically unfulfilled is basically what they are. So that's your introduction. I think that's enough. This video will be hopefully nice and short to biological molecules. So things to note, you're going to be asked to identify, is this an organic molecule or not? The easiest thing in the world, because does it have carbon? Does it have hydrogen? If it's got both of those things, it's an organic molecule. If it just has carbon, if it's CO2, carbon dioxide, or carbon monoxide, no. And, the reason carbon is so good is because carbon makes 4 bonds, really stable bonds. And so it's just stable. It's stable at room temperature. That's why carbon is the thing that is used. There are some organisms that use silicon or can use. I mean, we're probably going to make robots or something, but there are like bacteria. I think I just read about that somewhere, but we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about carbon. And then the other thing here of note is dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. What does that mean? Know that dehydration, synthesis is bringing things together. Dehydration is taking a water away. Hydrolysis is using water to break bonds. And hydrolysis also is an exothermic reaction. It's a warming reaction. It gets warm. It releases heat, releases energy. And then know what the biomolecules are. But then the next sections, you will know what they are, because the next sections I will go into more detail into those biomolecules. But basically you have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Obviously that is basically what you are made of. We're going to be seeing that as we continue on through all the units.